I'm Rachel Campos. Steffi, tonight we're uncovering America's darkest secret. Over the last 2 years, this country has become an international hub for child trafficking, and the U.S. government is behind it. Under Biden, hundreds of thousands of children have come into this country illegally. And once they get here, most are sold for sex, used for cheap labor, or are forced to join gangs. Nobody deserves this, especially not children. Congress called a whistleblower to testify at Capitol Hill today. Listen.
Today, children will work overnight shifts at slaughterhouses, factories, restaurants to pay their debts to smugglers and traffickers. Today, children will be sold for sex. Today, children will call a hotline to report they are being abused, neglected, and trafficked. And we don't know if they're going to get the help they need. For nearly a decade, unaccompanied children have been suffering in the shadows.
Tara Lee Rodas volunteered at the HHS to help kids. But when she got there, she found out they were doing the exact opposite.
I thought I was going to help place children in loving homes. Instead, I discovered that children are being trafficked through a sophisticated network that begins with recruiting in home country, smuggling to the U.S. border, and ends when ORR delivers a child to a sponsor. Some sponsors are criminals and traffickers and members of transnational criminal organizations. It could be argued that the United States government has become the middleman in a large-scale, multi-billion-dollar child trafficking operation that is run by bad actors seeking to profit off of the lives of children.
Joe Biden turned the federal government into the middleman for a child trafficking ring. Your tax dollars are paying for the last leg of the journey where we deliver migrant kids from the border to the hands of their abusers. Biden has tripled the supply of migrant children for the cartels to sell and abuse. Immigration expert Jessica Vaughn also testified.
Under the Biden policies, the annual number of UACs referred to HHS custody after crossing illegally has tripled from an average of 40,000 a year to more than 120,000 in each of the last 2 years. Half of the 600,000 unaccompanied minors who've been released in the country since 2012 have arrived on Biden's watch. Not only did he relax border controls and suppress immigration enforcement inside the country, when the numbers predictably exploded, his officials responded by gutting what few meager protections for child migrants still existed.
Biden tells the whole world our border is open. His policies incentivize kids to show up alone. But once they get here, the feds ship them off to adults who the kids might not even know, criminals, perverts, or cartel associates who force the terrified children to work until they pay off their debt. Biden knows this. It's been well documented, but he just shrugs it off.
But what is most infuriating is that even with all the well-documented risks and problems associated with the federal government taking custody of minors and adults claiming to be minors who are smuggled in and then releasing them to unvetted sponsors and then washing its hands of responsibility for them, even knowing the risks, still the Biden administration chose to throw gasoline on that dumpster fire by actually expanding opportunities for the illegal smuggling of minors into the country and expanding opportunities for these minors to be trafficked for cheap labor, commercial sex, gangs, and more.
Remember when AOC flew down to the border for a photo op? That was back when Trump was president, and she said that Trump was tearing families apart. I noticed AOC hasn't been crying in front of the border or any of the slaughterhouses or the child sex brothels. Where is she? Are her white pants maybe at the dry cleaner? Because the children are no longer politically useful to her, she abandons them, just like the ones the cartels abandon in the desert.
¿Qué pasó?
Es que yo venía con un grupo de personas y me dejaron botar y no sé dónde están.
No sabes dónde están. ¿Te dejaron solo?
Pues claro, me dejaron botar.
¿Te dejaron solo botado?
Solo.
¿No vienes con mami o con papi o con alguien?
¿Ah?
¿Vienes con tu mamá o tu papá?
Nadie. Yo venía en un grupo que venía de entrega con usted y al final me dejaron botar y venía aquí a pedir auxilio.
this isn't an accident. The New York Times caught HHS Secretary Javier Becerra saying the quiet part out loud. The Biden administration created a conveyor belt of illegal child labor.
If Henry Ford had seen this in his plans, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line. And kids aren't widgets, I get it. But we could do far better than this.
They don't care who the kids end up with. They just want to pump as many children through the system as they can. And this is what happens when you treat children like car parts on an assembly line.
A 20-plus-year-old man sponsored what we believed was his sister, who was only 16 years old. He submitted a birth certificate for himself and her as brother and sister. And then, about 10 days after she's released, we see she's for sale on his WhatsApp page.
Biden lured these children to America and then put them in the hands of criminals, and you paid for it.
Realizing that we were not offering the children the American dream, but instead putting them in modern-day slavery with wicked overlords, was a terrible revelation. A terrible revelation.
Tara Lee Rodas is a hero. She didn't have to blow the whistle. She did it because she has a heart. But after she went public, her bosses tried to shut her up.
Stop retaliating against whistleblowers. Stop retaliating against the people who are trying to tell the truth to save the children. They threatened me with investigation. They walked me off the emergency intake site, and they took my badge. It's a terrible thing when you blow the whistle and to try to save children, and then you are retaliated against for trying to help. HHS did everything they could to keep all of this silent.
Shameful. They opened our border, became knowingly complacent in trafficking children, and then tried to shut up the brave whistleblower. It's time to get Mayorkas and Becerra to pay for these crimes. Now let's bring in Tim Ballard. He is the CEO of Operation Underground Railroad. Welcome, Tim. Tell us explain to our viewers how this whole sophisticated network works and how our government is part of this.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say, Rachel, your monologue is spot on, and Ms. Rodas, the whistleblower, is an absolute hero. And this is what's happening. I spent 12 years on that border, undercover, fighting child trafficking, and it is exactly as you're describing. The policies of this administration are absolutely incentivizing. It's the wind at the sails of the traffickers. They're being told, come on in, you're going to get in, which is why the number of unaccompanied minors has tripled in that time period. And I've been on the border. What happens is these traffickers will put a name with the child, okay? Sometimes these kids are younger than 5 years old, and the name is a sponsor. And they get to the other side, and HHS will literally call the phone number. I've watched them do it, or the surrogates of HHS, and someone comes and picks them up, or our taxpayers pay for these kids to be delivered to whatever name the trafficker gave the child. It's that simple. We are making millions of dollars for child traffickers because of these policies, and children are getting hurt in ways that will only later we will discover.
Oh, of course. I mean, these are lifelong psychological wounds. In addition to everything else they're experiencing along the journey. So explain to me this, has the Biden administration, you've had an increase, your nonprofit is doing a lot right now. Have they shown any interest in what you're doing? Do they ask you guys, look, what are you seeing? How is this happening? What are we doing wrong? Or is this completely, planned? They know it's happening and they just don't care.
I wish that I could say that somehow they just are ignorant to it. Unfortunately, I've testified before Congress. I've testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee when then Senator Kamala Harris was there. They had all the information. They know exactly what's happening, and I can't conclude anything but that they absolutely know, and they're willing to sacrifice children to get these would-be hopeful Democratic voters into the country. I can't explain it any other way, and it's dreadful. It's horrifying.
What happens when your group actually rescues these children? What are you finding, and what happens to them after?
Well, we set up aftercare services before we'll do any kind of rescue operation with law enforcement, and that's the point. That's what I see when I see this conveyor belt coming in with these children, because the damage done to them is absolutely it's like nothing you can imagine. Florida recently, they're looking at a bill to criminalize the death penalty with raping a child, because murder is less bad than assaulting sexually a child. So that's what's happening to these children. We set up aftercare services, and we get to help them, and we have thousands that we're helping, many of whom we rescued ourselves. And that's the only way to kind of combat it until we can wake the administration up to cut off this pipeline of child trafficking.
Well, Tim, you're a hero. You're doing God's work. And I wish that somebody in this administration would see what you're doing and see what's happening and make a change, because this is just outrageous. Tim, thanks
thank you, Rachel, for being, thank you too for being a voice for these children.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.